Dawn had barely touched the fields when the overseer, a man named Winton Hale, walked his usual inspection path toward the slave quarters at the edge of the plantation. Most mornings were routine, men preparing tools, women tending small fires, children rubbing sleep from their eyes before chores. This morning, however, carried an unusual stillness, as if the air itself held its breath. Hale noticed movement in Cabin 7, a place normally quiet at daybreak. A few women stood outside whispering urgently, their hands trembling, eyes shifting constantly between him and the doorway. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Hale approached slowly, suspicious but curious, the soles of his boots crunching over the frost-hardened earth. As he neared, the whispers evaporated, replaced by a weighted hush. The women stepped aside without a word, each face etched with fear. Inside, the cabin was dim, the single lantern flickering in the corner, casting shadows against the rough wooden walls. The air smelled of smoke, old cotton, and something else, an unfamiliar scent that tightened the overseer's chest with unease. On the far side of the room, lying in a makeshift cradle of burlap cloth and old quilts, was a newborn baby. But it wasn't the presence of a baby that froze Hale in place. It was the baby's skin, pale, white, almost glowing against the dark fabric beneath it. The enslaved couple who lived in the cabin stood rigidly by the rear wall. The woman, Sarah, held her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. Her husband, John, had positioned himself slightly in front of her, not in defiance, but in fear of what accusations might follow. Hale felt the world tilt for a moment. His voice, when it finally emerged, was rough and uncertain. "Whose child is this?" Sarah's response came in a whisper so frail he almost missed it. "It ain't ours, sir. It was here when we woke." Hale's brows pulled together in a deep scowl. He stepped closer to the child, expecting to find some clue, perhaps a bundle of traveling cloth, a note, anything. But there was nothing, only the tiny infant wrapped in burlap too coarse for any white family, too unfamiliar to belong in this cabin. The baby stirred, blinking at the sudden presence towering above. Its cry was soft but sharp, slicing through the fragile silence. Sarah visibly flinched. "What do you mean it was here when you woke?" Hale demanded, his tone sharpened by confusion and the pressure of accountability. "You expect me to believe a white child just wandered in here?" John shook his head. "No, sir. We don't know how it got here. We swear it." Hale looked between them, searching for deceit, but Sarah's eyes shimmered with terror, not guilt, fear of what this discovery meant, fear of what blame might fall upon her family. He exhaled through his nose, a long, steady breath. The plantation owner, Mr. Barrett, would not take kindly to mysteries. Anything that threatened his reputation, anything that whispered scandal, anything that stirred suspicion of disobedience or wrongdoing among the enslaved community would be met with swift punishment. Hale knew it, they knew it. He lifted the baby gently, surprised by how calmly it rested against his arm. He wasn't a man used to holding children, certainly not newborns, but the child seemed oddly peaceful. He stepped outside, the women shrinking back as he emerged with the infant. The rest of the quarters were waking, now, drawn by the murmurs spreading rapidly cabin to cabin. Faces appeared in doorways, worried, curious, terrified. No one spoke loud enough for Hale to hear, yet whispers swarmed like bees in the air. Whispers of danger, whispers of suspicion. Hale barked at them to return to their chores, though he knew none would. He made his way toward the main house, the baby cradled awkwardly, its small hands curling in sleep. Mr. Barrett met him on the porch, coffee in hand, already irritated at being interrupted before breakfast. His expression hardened the moment he saw the child. "What in God's name is this?" he asked. Hale explained everything in clipped sentences, the discovery, the enslaved couple's reactions, the absence of explanation. Barrett listened in stony silence, tapping his fingers against the railing. When Hale finished, the plantation owner stepped closer and examined the baby with a frown. "No white family on this land is missing a child," he muttered. "We'd have heard something if one had gone missing in the county." His eyes drifted toward the distant slave quarters. "And don't even speak the possibility that they birthed it. That would be impossible with the couple we're discussing." Hale nodded stiffly. Barrett had said aloud what they all thought, but none dared voice. Sarah and John could not be the child's parents. There was no resemblance, and their terror had been too real. Something else, something unexplained, was at play. Could be abandonment, Hale offered. Some traveler, someone afraid to be found. Barrett gave him a sharp look. Travelers don't sneak onto plantations and leave white infants in slave cabins, not unless they want to be shot. Hale had no argument for that. Barrett exhaled sharply through his teeth, then handed the baby back with a look of disgusted confusion. "Take the child to Mrs. Dawson at the church, let her deal with it." And just like that, the matter was dismissed officially. But unofficially, it burrowed into every shadow of the plantation. The enslaved families whispered through the night, wondering who had brought the baby, why their cabins were being chosen, and what it meant for their future. They feared accusations, they feared punishment, they feared the unknown. Each cabin became a fortress of anxiety, doors tied shut with rope, lanterns kept burning long past midnight. Days passed with no answers. Hale continued his rounds with greater suspicion, watching for anything out of place. The enslaved community moved with forced obedience, their eyes constantly shifting, searching for signs that another child might appear. Just when the confusion began to fade, when people started convincing themselves it had been a strange one-time incident, something happened that shattered that temporary sense of calm. Another baby appeared, this time in cabin 4, another pale-skinned newborn left without explanation, just as before, wrapped in worn cloth, placed carefully on a quilt belonging to the enslaved family living there. The screams of discovery echoed through the quarters, bringing Hale running, and the moment he saw the second child, his heart dropped into his stomach. One incident could be dismissed, two could not. He stared at the infant for several long seconds, his mind racing. Whatever was happening was deliberate. Someone was moving through the quarters at night. Someone was leaving babies behind. Someone was risking their life to do it. When he questioned the family in cabin 4, their fear was identical to that of Sarah and John. They insisted the child had not been there when they went to sleep. They begged Hale to believe them, and he did, because the terror in their voices was unmistakable. Rumors spread through the county before sundown. People speculated wildly about kidnappings, about hidden mothers, about ghosts even. Stories clashed and tangled, none making sense. Barrett was furious, pacing the porch, barking orders, threatening any enslaved person he suspected might have information. But no threats produced answers because no one knew the truth. All anyone knew was that something was moving in the darkness, slipping past guards, past padlocks, past lantern light, leaving helpless children in cabins where no one wanted to be accused of wrongdoing. Then came the third baby, and the fourth, and by the fifth the entire state was talking. The tension in the quarters became suffocating. Nobody slept deeply. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves outside, every distant cry sent families sitting upright in terror, clutching their own children close. Women prayed over their cabins. Men kept makeshift weapons nearby, not to harm whoever was leaving the babies, but to stop them before their presence brought more trouble. For every child discovered, accusations grew sharper. Overseers questioned families relentlessly. Owners demanded explanations. And the enslaved people, powerless to stop the events unfolding around them, could only ask one another the question that haunted their every waking hour: who was leaving these babies, and why? By the time the fifth infant was discovered, Hale no longer cared about plausible explanations. Something was happening beneath the surface of this community, something calculated, something hidden, and though he couldn't explain it, he could feel its weight settling on the land like a storm ready to break. The mystery had begun with one child found in a dim cabin corner just before dawn, but now it had grown into something far bigger, something that threatened to unravel the plantation, the county, and even the illusions of order the owners clung to. Hale felt the truth pressing. At the edges of his consciousness, whispering that the explanation, when it came, would be nothing like what they expected. And he was right, because the real answer, what they eventually uncovered, would shake Alabama to its core. The nights in the slave quarters changed after the first few babies were found. Before, the cabins had always been places of weary routine, families returning from the fields, exhausted, tending to small fires, sharing whatever limited food they had, whispering stories to quiet their children, but now every evening carried a heaviness no one could shake. Fear settled in the corners like dust. Even the animals sensed it. Dogs barked at shadows, mules snorted uneasily, and the horses in the stables stamped their hooves at seemingly nothing. For the enslaved families, the fear wasn't merely about mystery. It was about survival. They lived close enough to danger every day, under suspicion, under control, under threat. The sudden appearance of white children in their cabins added a new terror, one they had never imagined. It wasn't simply strange, it was dangerous. A white child in a slave cabin could mean accusations, punishments, or worse. Anyone could be blamed, anyone could suffer. Every night, people locked their cabin doors with whatever they had: Ropes, planks wedged under handles, even pieces of broken metal hammered into the frame. There were no actual locks. The cabins weren't built to protect the enslaved residents from intrusion. But they crafted their own barriers, weak as they were, clinging to the hope that it might keep the unknown visitor out. Sarah, from cabin 7, barely slept at all since the discovery of the first child. Each night she sat near the door with her knees pulled to her chest, listening. Every sound became a possible danger. The creak of a branch, the rustle of the wind, the footsteps of patrolling overseers. Her husband John tried to reassure her, but he too slept lightly, waking at the smallest noise. Their own children huddled close to them, confused by their mother's trembling hands, frightened by the strain etched into their father's face. Children throughout the quarters sensed the growing tension. They clung to skirts, cried more often, and refused to sleep alone. Mothers whispered lullabies that no longer comforted. Fathers stood in doorways, staring into the darkness longer than necessary. No one walked outside after sunset unless absolutely forced to, and if they did, they moved quickly, shoulders hunched, eyes darting. When the second baby appeared, the fear worsened. No one knew how someone could slip between the cabins unnoticed. The overseers patrolled, carrying lanterns and rifles, boots crunching over gravel. But the mysterious figure, whoever they were, managed to evade them, passing through the quarters like smoke, silent and unseen. Some families claimed they had heard the sound of steps right outside their windows in the middle of the night. A soft shuffle, not like the heavy steps of an overseer. Others said they heard a voice, fragile and quiet, humming a tune no one recognized. A few insisted they saw a pale shape gliding through the trees, too fast to identify. But these sightings were inconsistent, blurred by the fear that colored everyone's imagination. Yet one detail was repeated again and again. Whoever moved through the quarters was gentle. Cabins were not broken into. Doors were not forced open. Children were placed carefully, wrapped in cloth, positioned where they'd be noticed at first light. Nothing in the cabins was disturbed. It was as if the mysterious intruder wanted only one thing, for the babies to be found safely. But that did not ease the terror. Intentions didn't matter. Consequences did. The plantation owner, Mr. Barrett, denied the enslaved families' pleas that they were innocent. He walked through the quarters with tight lips and narrowed eyes, accusing some families directly, threatening others with consequences if they knew more than they were saying. The fear of punishment grew so intense that many struggled to breathe whenever Barrett approached. Slaves whispered among themselves at night, gathering in small groups behind cabins or near the drying racks where the owner's eyes couldn't reach. They shared their fears, speculated about who or what might be bringing the infants. Some believed it was a runaway woman from another plantation, hiding in the woods. Others thought it was a ghost of someone who had died giving birth alone. A few older women muttered that the land itself was cursed, that the soil had seen too much pain, too much blood, and now twisted the world in ways no one understood. None of the theories made anyone feel safer. To avoid being accused, families began documenting their nights in ways they never had before. They left their cabin doors open until just before sleep, making sure overseers could see that nothing unusual was happening. Some mothers kept buckets of water near their beds. If they had to prove they hadn't left their homes, they would point to the undisturbed water sitting on the floor. Others tied bells to ropes across their doors so they would wake if anyone entered. But even these precautions sparked more fear, because every measure they took reminded them of the danger that lingered. One night, the Stevens family, living in cabin 11, heard a faint tapping on their window. The sound was so gentle it could have been a loose shutter in the wind, but the family froze. The tapping continued, rhythmic, persistent. The mother pulled her sleeping daughter closer to her chest, covering the child's mouth with her hand to stifle any sound. The father moved toward the window slowly, holding a wooden spoon like a weapon, because it was the only thing he had. When he peeked through the cracked boards, he saw nothing, only darkness. And when he returned to his mat, he whispered to his wife that the tapping hadn't been from the shutter, but from the outside of the glass. Another night, a young girl named Ruth, barely 10 years old, woke up screaming, convinced she saw a woman standing in the doorway. Her parents soothed her, convincing her it was just a dream. But in whispers later, they both admitted they had heard footsteps outside just moments before she woke. Fear made everyone alert to things they had previously ignored. The whippoorwill's cry in the trees suddenly sounded like sobbing. The creak of an old branch became the sound of someone stepping closer. The distant howl of wolves seemed almost human. Fear blurred the lines between reality and imagination until no one trusted their senses. The enslaved community tightened together, each family clinging to the others. Women began staying in groups at night, gathering in one cabin to sleep together for safety. Men built makeshift barricades from broken tools and old planks, though they knew it would barely slow anyone. They posted informal watches, not to stop the intruder themselves, but to witness it, to prove they were innocent. Every evening, before the overseer's lanterns faded in the distance, the enslaved families gathered near the edge of the quarters to talk about the day. Some spoke openly, others whispered. Yet the underlying fear bound them all. They were united in confusion, terror, and desperation to avoid being blamed. Then came the loudest night of all. It was the night after the third baby appeared. Thunder rolled across the sky, lightning carving jagged lines over the fields. Rain beat against the cabins, washing mud into the paths between them. The storm was so loud that some people slept more deeply, exhausted from worry. Others lay awake, unable to separate the sounds of wind from imagined footsteps. In the storm's chaos, a woman named Hattie woke to the sound of crying, not her child's. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. Her own baby was asleep at her side, but the crying was outside, faint but unmistakable. Hattie shook her husband awake. He opened the door cautiously, letting rain whip inside, soaking his clothes. Through the sheets of water, he saw something small lying near their doorstep. They did not touch it. They called for Hale immediately, terrified he might accuse them of hiding it. When Hale arrived in the middle of the storm, lantern in hand, he found the crying infant soaked in rainwater, wrapped in a cloth that was quickly becoming drenched. The baby was shivering, weak, its cry barely audible above the thunder. Hale stared at it for a long moment, the rain dripping from his hat, his coat clinging to him. He knew immediately that the baby had been placed there just minutes before. The rain would have soaked it through had it been left earlier. Someone had been bold enough to move through the quarters during the worst storm of the year. Someone who either didn't fear the overseers or was too desperate to wait for a calmer moment. And now fear turned to panic. If someone could slip past guards and dogs in a storm, what else were they capable of? What else might they do? Hale's shouts echoed through the quarters, ordering families to stay inside, demanding answers that no one had. But the enslaved people only stared back at him with fear widening their eyes. They had nothing to give. They were as lost as he was. From that night on, a new suspicion took root, one more frightening than all the others, because if an outsider was doing this, the danger was real. But if someone from within the plantation was involved, then no one could be trusted. Each cabin became an island, every family guarding themselves not only from outsiders, but from the possibility that someone among them might be responsible. Conversations quieted. People stopped sharing food across cabins. Women kept their daughters closer. Men spoke in lower tones. The fear that had once united the enslaved community now threatened to divide them, turning suspicion inward. But even through the fear, there was one truth no one dared speak aloud. Whoever was placing those babies in the cabins was not doing it to harm the enslaved families. The care with which the infants were placed, the gentle wrapping, the quiet footsteps, all hinted at someone trying desperately to hide something bigger. But what? Whoever it was, they moved through the quarters with ghost-like precision, slipping between shadows, leaving helpless infants behind as if pleading silently for help. And though no one understood the reason, everyone sensed that the truth, whatever it was, would be devastating. Soon it would be impossible to hide the mystery any longer, because the next discovery would not be a baby. It would be a clue, and it would change everything Alabama thought it knew about the nightmare unfolding in the slave quarters. The sheriff had never seen the county this restless. For weeks now, people stopped him in the street, at the general store, even outside the church, asking the same question he had no answer to: who was leaving white infants in slave cabins? His badge felt heavier each morning, not because of the metal, but because of the pressure, the murmurs of scandal, the tightening fear along the plantation lines, the growing suspicion that the entire county was becoming the stage of something unholy. When the fifth baby appeared, the community reached its breaking point. That morning, he stood outside the fifth cabin, staring at the small bundle wrapped in coarse cloth. The infant slept peacefully, unaware of the storm around him. The enslaved family stood outside trembling, the mother clutching her own children to her skirt as if shielding them from an accusation she couldn't survive. The sheriff started with questions, not out of suspicion. He knew these families lived under constant danger already, but because someone needed to break the silence. Yet every answer he received was the same: we don't know. We found him just before dawn. We heard something outside, but when we opened the door, only the child was there. What chilled him wasn't the fear in their voices, but the sincerity. These people, already burdened with hardship, were now dealing with a nightmare not of their making. The plantation owner, red-faced and trembling with rage, insisted on immediate answers. According to him, this was a conspiracy. Maybe abolitionists were planting babies to cause chaos. Maybe a rival plantation owner was trying to frame him. Maybe, his voice lowered, maybe the enslaved families were hiding something. The sheriff dismissed that theory. It didn't fit. Nothing about this fit. When he returned to his small office, he spread the 5 incident reports across his desk. Each file was thin, filled with more questions than clues. The babies had been found in different cabins, different plantations, even different nights of the week. No patterns, no footprints, no witnesses, only the faint scent of pine and swamp mud lingering on the cloth each baby had been wrapped in. The sheriff's mind began to circle around the one possibility no one wanted to speak aloud. Perhaps the person leaving the infants wasn't targeting the enslaved families at all. Perhaps they were seeking refuge among them. That afternoon, he decided to begin questioning people outside the plantations. H.E. visited the midwife who lived on the edge of town, a woman who had delivered hundreds of babies over 3 decades. She shook her head before he even finished the question. "No white woman has birthed in this county in months," she said firmly, "and no one pregnant enough to deliver 5 babies could have gone unnoticed." The sheriff believed her. Midwives were the true keepers of a town's secrets. From there, he traveled to the small convent where nuns often provided shelter to abandoned children. The sister in charge informed him that none of their wards were missing, and no woman had come to them seeking refuge or birth care. Each answer narrowed the possibilities further, tightening the noose around the mystery. His next step was the woods, specifically the pine forests that bordered the plantation lines. With 2 deputies trailing behind, he combed through the underbrush, following faint impressions left by someone moving during nighttime hours. But the forest swallowed clues. Pine needles shifted, rain washed away traces, and small animal tracks overlapped with the footprints he hoped to follow. Hours turned into days, and still nothing. Not until a shy teenage enslaved boy, trembling and unsure, approached the sheriff with something close to fear in his eyes. The sheriff had come to the plantation that day to re-interview the families, hoping someone had remembered something new. The boy tugged on his sleeve while avoiding eye contact. When finally coaxed into speaking, he whispered about a pale-skinned figure he'd seen moving near the cabins 2 nights before the last baby was found, not walking boldly but slipping between shadows, almost gliding. The sheriff felt the first spark of direction since the beginning of the investigation. A white woman, a girl, someone disguised, someone injured. He pressed for details, but the boy only repeated that the figure seemed small, thin, and frightened. She was carrying something, he added in a voice barely above a breath. That statement lodged itself deep into the sheriff's mind. The next day, a second enslaved worker, a quiet older man who usually kept to himself, confessed he had seen something similar. He had initially stayed quiet because he feared being accused of hiding the mysterious woman. The sheriff thanked him, aware of the risk it took to say even that. 2 sightings, same description, same behavior. The sheriff finally felt the mystery stretch toward an answer. A runaway white woman would explain the fear, the secrecy, and perhaps even the abandoned infants. But who? And how had she gone unnoticed for months? That evening, he returned to his office and pored over missing persons reports from neighboring counties. A few travelers, 1 merchant, a schoolteacher, but no young woman who matched the descriptions. It made no sense. If a woman had disappeared, someone would have raised an alarm, unless the people who knew she was missing had chosen silence. The sheriff rubbed his temples. The possibility was dark, but he couldn't shake it. That night, he and 2 deputies staked out the cabins under the cover of darkness. Lanterns dimmed. The woods loomed behind them like a wall of shadows. Hours passed. Crickets chirped. The summer air thickened. Nothing moved, until just before dawn, when a rustle near the tree line caught their attention. The sheriff motioned for silence, hand on his revolver. Something, or someone, slipped between the pines. A faint shape, small, slender. He took a step forward, heart pounding, but when his boot cracked a twig, the figure bolted back into the woods with surprising speed. The sheriff and his deputies chased her for nearly a mile, but the forest swallowed her, as it had swallowed every clue before. Still, this time he had seen enough to believe the boy's story. She wasn't a ghost or a rumor. She was real, and she was trying to avoid being caught. The next morning, the sheriff informed the plantation owners that he believed they were dealing with a runaway woman. Their reactions varied: anger from some, disbelief from others, and from a few, a strange silence that suggested they knew more than they admitted. One planter, an older man with trembling hands, muttered under his breath that some families hide their shame better than others. When the sheriff asked for clarification, the man grew pale and shook his head. "Forget I said that." But the sheriff didn't forget. Days later, he found himself examining the cloth wrappers used for the infants again. All 5 had been torn from the same type of fabric, thick, rough material often used in travel cloaks or winter skirts. Not something enslaved families owned, not something plantation workers wore, something belonging to a white woman. That evening, he held the scraps against the lantern light. The edges were frayed, but he noticed something new. A faint stitch pattern, hand-sewn but delicate. A woman's stitching, likely done in haste. He closed his eyes and pictured a terrified woman alone in the woods, giving birth without help, tearing her own clothes to swaddle her newborns, placing them in the only place she believed they'd be safe, among families who understood suffering and secrecy. The idea haunted him. But a question lingered: why didn't she seek help openly? Why hide? Why risk this dangerous cycle for months? Unless she had more to fear than just discovery. The sheriff made another decision, one that would change everything. He summoned the county map, spread it across his desk, and traced the swampy regions beyond the plantations. There were hidden trails, old hunting shacks, abandoned huts from settlers decades ago. Any of those could be shelter. The sheriff realized that if the woman had been avoiding towns and main roads, she must be living somewhere remote, somewhere forgotten. And if she was giving birth multiple times over months, she must be trapped in a life no one knew about. Driven by desperation, hiding from someone far more dangerous than the law. The sheriff felt a slow dread settle in his stomach. He had been following the mystery as though someone out there was committing a crime. But what if the real crime had happened long before those infants ever reached the cabins? What if the woman wasn't a perpetrator, but a victim fleeing from someone whose power could silence an entire county? That night, he stood again in the doorway of his office, staring out into the humid Alabama dusk. The sun bled orange across the horizon like a warning. The pieces were forming a picture, one he wasn't sure he wanted to see, yet he knew the truth was now close enough to touch. Close enough to change everything the county believed about power, protection, and the secrets people bury to keep reputations clean. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin the search deeper, into the swamps, into abandoned structures, into the places where shame is hidden and sins are buried. Because somewhere out there, a woman was running out of places to hide, and the truth was running out of places to stay buried. The sheriff could not shake the image of the thin figure slipping through the trees, vanishing as though the forest had swallowed her whole. Every instinct in him, honed from years of dealing with men who hid secrets behind money and status, told him that the truth of the abandoned infants lay somewhere deep within the swamp. He felt it, like a pulse in the earth guiding him. And so, days after setting aside the cloth wrappings and realizing the pattern of a woman's stitching, he gathered 2 deputies, packed lanterns, ropes, and enough water to last a full day, and headed toward the murky border where plantation land met the dark, tangled swamp. The swamp was a world of its own, a place where sunlight seeped in weak, green-tinted beams through heavy canopies, where the air smelled of mud and decaying leaves, and where every sound echoed strangely, as if carried by unseen spirits. People in the county rarely ventured there. Stories about the swamp were older than the plantations, whispers of lost travelers, of strange lights flickering at night, of cries that sounded like women begging for help and then suddenly falling as Lent. Whether the stories were superstition or rooted in forgotten tragedies didn't matter. What mattered was that no one went in unless they had to. But the sheriff had to. With each step, the ground grew softer beneath their boots, swallowing footprints and reminding them that the place would hide any secret offered to it. The sheriff kept one hand on his revolver, not out of fear of animals, but because he knew that desperate people sometimes behaved like cornered beasts, and if the woman they were pursuing had survived months alone, she might fight like someone who had nothing left to lose. They walked for nearly an hour, before they found the first sign of something unnatural, a thin strip of cloth snagged on a thorny vine. The sheriff moved closer, heart tightening. It was the same coarse material as the wrappings from the infants torn at the edges. Someone had passed through recently, too recently for it to be coincidence. He pocketed the cloth and motioned forward. The deputies exchanged nervous glances but followed without question. Deeper into the swamp they went. Birds screeched overhead. Dragonflies darted around them. the sound of their boots sloshing through shallow pools mixed with the melody of distant water dripping from trees, and then they saw it, a narrow path that didn't belong to nature. The underbrush there had been pushed aside repeatedly, the earth slightly packed down, a trail made by someone small, frequent, and cautious. The sheriff's pulse quickened. The path wound in ways no normal traveler would choose, zigzagging between trees, curving around thorn thickets, doubling back once or twice as though the person who made it was hiding their location from anyone who might follow. The sheriff recognized the tactic. Hunters used it. So did people fleeing someone they feared. They followed the winding path for another few minutes until the trees parted to reveal a forgotten clearing the size of a small room. And there, crouched beneath a collapsing roof and walls made of half-rotted logs, stood a shack. It looked like it might have been built decades ago, abandoned during early settlement years when people tried to tame the swamp and failed. The shack leaned like a man on a broken leg, covered in vines and wild moss. Its wood was gray and spongy from constant moisture, but smoke, thin, almost invisible, curled from a small hole at the top. The sheriff froze. Someone was inside. He raised a hand to stop his deputies. Every sense in him sharpened. The clearing felt heavy, like the air held its breath. The sheriff approached slowly, each step deliberate. The closer he got, the more he noticed signs of recent habitation. Footprints around the doorway, a cluster of broken sticks that might have been used as fire kindling, scraps of clothing half buried beneath leaves. He reached the door, which hung crookedly from one hinge, and gently pushed it open. The smell inside hit him first. A mixture of damp wood, stale smoke, and something faintly floral, like crushed wildflowers. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he took in the shack's interior. It was small, barely enough space for 3 people to stand, the walls patched with old fabric and strips of bark to keep the wind out. In the corner lay a pile of blankets, worn thin but neatly arranged. Beside it sat a crude wooden bowl and a stack of cloths, each folded with surprising care. And on the far wall, pinned flat and protected by the driest part of the shack, were several pages of a diary. The sheriff moved toward them slowly, afraid the slightest disturbance would make them crumble. The ink was faded, run through by moisture in places, but the handwriting was delicate, elegant, clearly that of a woman educated enough to write beautifully, even in distress. He read the first legible line, "They locked me in the room again today." He swallowed hard. The next line chilled him deeper. "My father says I am sick, but I know the truth. He only wants me hidden." He kept reading, each sentence pulling him deeper into the horror of the woman's life. Her words told the story of a young white woman whose father, a wealthy and respected figure in society, had committed her to secrecy, not because she was insane, but because she had become pregnant. Pregnant under circumstances she did not describe in detail at first. At that point in the diary, the sheriff wondered if she had simply fallen in love with someone her father disapproved of. But then, as he scanned further, he reached a passage that struck him like a blow to the chest. "I wish I could erase him from my mind. I wish God had made me strong enough to fight him. But he comes into my room when the house sleeps, and I cannot stop him." The sheriff felt his jaw clench until it hurt. The deputies behind him shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in his breathing. He forced himself to continue reading. "When the first baby came, they took it from me. They said it died. I do not know if it's true. I only know that they don't want anyone to see what he has done. They say I am unwell, but I see everything." The sheriff's mind raced. A woman locked away, a father abusing his own daughter, babies disappearing without record, and now the mysterious infants found in cabins across the county. He moved to the next page, this one less damaged by moisture. "I escaped last spring. The window was small, but freedom was on the other side of it. I did not know where to go. I hid in the swamp because no one comes here. I had my second child alone. I wrapped him in the only cloth I had." The sheriff exhaled shakily. Her handwriting grew uneven, the letters trembling. "I left him in the cabin of the colored family near the East Field. I knew they would take him in. People who endure suffering understand suffering. People who know cruelty know how to protect." The sheriff closed his eyes for a moment. It made sense now why the infants were placed there, why she chose slave cabins instead of church steps or doctors' porches. She believed the enslaved families, despite their own oppression, would show compassion, and they had. They always had. He opened his eyes and read the final page pinned to the wall. "I am pregnant again. He found me once in the woods months ago. I ran. God forgive me, I ran while carrying his child. but I will not let another suffer under his roof. If I must give birth alone each time and leave them in safer hands, then I will. I will protect them in the only way I can." At the bottom of the page was a line that made the sheriff's breath stop entirely. "If I disappear before you find me, please do not let him find my children." The sheriff stood very still in the middle of the decaying shack. The swamp buzzed with life outside, but inside everything was quiet except for the faint echo of the woman's pain hanging in the air. He could feel her presence, her fear, her desperation embedded in the walls. Finally, one deputy broke the silence. "Sheriff, where do you think she is now?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the pile of blankets in the corner. They were warm. Not hot, but warm enough that someone had recently been lying there. He looked at the small remnants of a burned fire under the floorboards. The ashes were gray, but not cold. She had been here not long ago. He felt a strange mixture of frustration, relief, and dread. They were close, very close. But if they were close, so was the danger surrounding her. The sheriff stepped out of the shack, scanning the swamp with new wonders. Tanding. The trees seemed to whisper, the vines seemed to twitch. The swamp hadn't just been her hiding place, it had been her sanctuary, the only place where a woman fleeing the man who destroyed her life could remain invisible. But she wasn't safe, not if her father realized she was alive. The sheriff knew then that the real investigation was only beginning. The truth about the infants was tragic, but the truth behind the man responsible was monstrous. And if that man discovered the search party in the swamp, everything, the woman's life, the children's lives, the enslaved families' lives, would be at risk. He adjusted his hat, eyes narrowing as he studied the ground for fresh tracks. "Spread out," he said quietly. "She's close, and we're not leaving without her." But as they moved deeper into the swamp, something told him they weren't the only ones searching. Someone else, someone much more dangerous, might already be on her trail. And the sheriff feared they were running out of time. Faster than the swamp, faster than silence, faster than the truth could reveal itself. The truth did not arrive like a thunderclap. It did not roar into the county with shouts or riots or torches. Instead, it crept in quietly, soft as morning mist, beginning with a single sheet of paper carried by the sheriff to the judge's estate. A paper that contained the diary pages he found in the shack, carefully dried near a lantern flame, smoothed and placed in his satchel. A paper that, once delivered, would unravel one of the most guarded reputations in Alabama. As he rode toward the judge's mansion, the sheriff felt a heaviness he had never carried before. Not fear for himself, but fear for the woman whose words he now bore. Fear for the children she had left behind. Fear for the enslaved families unknowingly entangled in a story far darker than anyone deserved. When he reached the gates, the judge's servants recognized his badge and let him through without question. The mansion stood tall, white columns gleaming like polished bone, its gardens perfectly trimmed. It was a kind of home built to reflect power and purity. But the sheriff now knew what secrets such walls could hide. Inside, he found the judge in his study, surrounded by law books, certificates, and oil portraits that celebrated his status. The man greeted him with formal politeness, but the sheriff watched his eyes. They were sharp, calculating, always measuring. The sheriff spoke plainly. "A young woman, possibly connected to your family, maybe in danger. I need information." The judge's jaw tightened, barely noticeable. "What woman?" he asked, too quickly, too sharply. The sheriff laid the diary pages on the table without a word. The judge's eyes flicked to them, and in that brief moment something cracked. Not his expression, not his stance, but something deeper, barely visible, the thin shell of a man keeping a monstrous truth buried. He didn't reach for the pages, didn't touch them, didn't even glance again. Instead, he leaned back and exhaled slowly as if calculating his next move. "Sheriff," he said carefully, "you should tread lightly with whatever fiction you believe you've found." The sheriff felt his pulse slow into something colder. "These pages weren't fiction," he replied. "They were written by a woman who's been missing from this county for months, a woman who says she was locked away, a woman who says she gave birth multiple times." The judge's expression didn't fully break, but it hardened, like stone forming behind the eyes. "Many women have delusions," he said, "especially those unfit for polite society. You've been misled." But the sheriff had seen fear before, the real kind, the kind men tried to hide. And there it was, flickering at the edge of the judge's composure. The sheriff pressed further. "5 infants, all white, have been found in slave cabins over the past months. 5, all wrapped in scraps of the same cloth, the same stitching." He paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle. "Your daughter stitched like that, didn't she?" That single question changed everything. Silence. not the quiet of hesitation, but the silence of a man whose entire kingdom of lies had been touched for the first time. Finally, the judge spoke, voice low. "If you know where she is," he said, "tell me." The sheriff's stomach tightened. That was not the response of a concerned father. That was the response of a man controlling damage. But the sheriff had learned enough through years of work to recognize a predator disguised in finery. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not here to give you anything," he said. "I'm here to find her before you do." For the first time, the judge's calm cracked. His hand clenched around the arm of his chair. The sheriff didn't wait for the man to regain control. He picked up the diary pages and left the mansion, his boots echoing through the hallway like gunshots. The confrontation confirmed everything. The judge was not only involved, he was the source of the nightmare. Now the sheriff knew the woman's fear wasn't imagined. It was rooted in years of survival under the authority of a man whose name commanded the county, but whose actions hid behind locked doors. He returned to town with urgency, gathering a small group of men he trusted, men who did not answer to the judge, who understood justice not as a tool for the powerful, but as a responsibility. They headed back toward the swamp at dusk. The sun dipped low, bleeding red along the horizon, while the trees cast long shadows across the ground. The sheriff walked ahead, lantern in hand. He moved quietly, listening for anything out of place. They reached the abandoned shack just as darkness settled fully, but the sheriff halted the moment he saw the clearing. The blanket pile inside was gone. The bowl and cloths were missing. Something had changed, and then he noticed the footprints, fresh ones, small and light, leading out the back of the shack toward deeper swampland. But next to them were larger prints, heavy, male. His heart pounded. Someone else had already been here. They followed the tracks deep into the swamp, moving swiftly but carefully. The air felt tense, as though something unseen was watching them. Finally, they reached a narrow, hidden pathway between two large cypress trees. The sheriff raised his lantern, and in the distance he saw her, thin, fragile, barefoot, clothes torn from months in the swamp, her hair hanging wild around her shoulders. In her arms she held a newborn wrapped in a strip of torn cloth, her eyes air enormous, haunted, exhausted, yet filled with a fierce, desperate love. She froze when she saw them. The sheriff raised his hand slowly. "I'm here to help," he said gently. "I'm not here to take your child." She shook her head violently, stepping back, clutching the baby tighter. "No," she whispered. "He sent you." The sheriff shook his head. "No, I read your diary. I know what he did. I know why you ran. I know why you left the children where you did." Her breath caught. Tears welled in her eyes, but she still did not move. The sheriff softened his voice even further. "You're not safe out here anymore. We found the shack, and someone else did too." Her body trembled, not from cold, from terror. She looked down at her baby, sobbing silently. "He'll take him," she choked out. "He'll take all of them. He'll hide what he did." The sheriff shook his head firmly. "Not this time." She stared at him, searching for deceit, searching for the traps she'd grown up surrounded by, but what she saw on his face was something she hadn't seen in years, protection rather than danger. Slowly she loosened her grip on panic, but not on her baby. "I can't go back," she whispered. "Not to that house, not to him." The sheriff nodded. "You won't." But before he could take another step toward her, a branch cracked somewhere to the right, loud, deliberate. The sheriff spun around. A figure stepped out of the shadows. The moonlight revealed the outline of a tall man, the judge. His clothes were soaked with swamp water, his hair disheveled, his face twisted with something dark and furious. The woman gasped, a sound of pure terror. The infant whimpered. The sheriff positioned himself between her and the judge instantly. "You don't belong here," the sheriff said, hand hovering near his holster. The judge's voice was low, venomous. "That girl is my responsibility, my blood. You have no authority to interfere." The sheriff's deputies flanked his sides. "I know what you did," the sheriff said quietly, "and you're not taking her." The judge's face twisted. "You think the word of a sick girl can stain my name?" His voice shook, not from fear, but from the rage of a man threatened with exposure. "She needs treatment. She always has. She's unstable. No," the sheriff cut in. "She's a survivor." The judge's eyes flicked to the baby trembling in her arms. "That child," he said through gritted teeth, "belongs to me." The sheriff drew his revolver in one smooth motion. "Go any closer," he warned, "and you won't leave this swamp." The air was electric, heavy. The judge looked at the sheriff, then at the deputies, and finally at the woman whose life he had controlled for years. And for the first time in perhaps his entire life, he realized he had lost control. He took a single step back, then another, before turning and disappearing into the darkness. The sheriff didn't lower his gun until the sound of footsteps faded completely. When he finally turned to the woman, she had collapsed to her knees, sobbing, quiet, relieved sobs that shook through her entire body. He knelt beside her. "You're safe now," he said softly. But her voice trembled as she whispered, "What about my children, the ones I left? Are they safe?" The sheriff nodded. "They're safe, and now we're going to protect you too." He helped her stand. She held her baby close as they walked back through the swamp, lantern light guiding their path. It was dawn when they emerged, sunlight spilling golden across the fields. The sheriff took her not to a jail, not to a hospital, but to the only place he knew she could find refuge, a small community of abolitionist women who ran a hidden safe house on the edge of the county. They welcomed her with open arms, no judgment, no fear, only compassion. Over the next days they cared for her, fed her, clothed her, and listened to her story. Slowly she began to heal. The truth about her father spread quietly but firmly. People whispered, some denied it, others believed it instantly, but the sheriff made sure the truth reached higher authorities, men beyond the judge's influence. And when investigators arrived weeks later, they found enough evidence to confront him. The judge never stood trial. Some say he fled, others say he took his own life. But the one truth that remained was this: his reign of fear ended the day his daughter stepped out of the swamp. As for the white infants found in the slave cabins, each one was taken in by families who grew to love them. They were raised with dignity, not secrecy. And the woman, though scarred by her past, built a new life surrounded by people who valued her not for her lineage, but for her strength. She never again returned to the swamp, but she carried its memory as the place where she found the courage to protect her children and the strength to free herself from the man who tried to destroy her. And the county, shaken by what it had discovered, never forgot the truth hidden behind the white babies found in the slave cabins, nor the woman who survived long enough to reveal it.